Well, this is a lecture on History 1301, a lecture, first of two or maybe three parts on the Civil War. The Civil War is the most important event in the history of the United States. It is in some respects, the hinge point on which the nation turns. Certainly, it saves the nation in the sense that the Union is not dissolved. The Southern states do not have a right to secede, and they are forcibly kept into the Union by their loss in the war. It is certainly important and one of the greatest events, also because of its effects upon the nation. Yes, it saved the Union. It fundamentally transforms the relationship between the states and the federal government. All the outworkings of that change are still being felt to this day and still being developed to this day. In 2020 is when this is being recorded. But the federal government clearly will be supreme in relationship to the states in the aftermath of the Civil War. The old ideas of states' rights, generally speaking, will be shunted to the back and to the rear of the room, only to be taken up normally by people who are outside of power. Normally, when you hear the issue of states' rights, it's not always true. But if someone pipes up about states' rights, it's normally because they have no power or they have not been elected lately, particularly with regard to the federal government. When they become elected and they get into power, whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or some other party, the idea of states' rights and sharing power with the states and making the states do things, well, that's out the window. So, but fundamentally, the federal government is supreme in the aftermath of this war. That takes on greater and larger dimensions in the 20th century for various reasons, but it starts, I would say, here. Another fundamental fact that changes during the American Civil War is not just the relationship between the states and the government, but also what the government is to do for the people. In another lecture, I will talk about what you might call as Abraham Lincoln as the Whig Jupiter, and what he is looking to do and to change the face of the nation. Some fundamental and extraordinarily important changes that would have made him an important president in our history had it not been the Civil War, making him a great president in our history. And of course, last but not least, what makes the Civil War so important is, of course, it rips out root and branch the institution of slavery and abolishes it through the battlefield and the Constitution and the 13th Amendment once and for all. So all that put together is that you have this great event. It's great in its affecting of many, many people. If you lived in Texas, you were going to be affected by it, especially if you had kids who got sucked into the conflict. If you lived in Maine, a smallish state in the Union at that time, it was, and today actually as well, you too would have been sucked into that conflict. So all together, it is a big thing. So we'll go through it rather systematically, not thoroughly. If you ever wondered in American history how many books have been published in it, thousands and thousands of books have been published on some facet of the Civil War, some on a grand scale, some on a minute and granular scale. You can talk about the politics of the war. You can talk about the characters in the war. You can talk about the war itself as far as fighting, soldier's life, and on and on and on. It's a fascinating subject, and for me, in some respects, it is the thing that I always have loved the most about history, and I may have loved it the most since I was a kid. And so I've read probably more than I need to on the Civil War, but I find it a well that I can keep going back to for my intellectual pursuits and enjoyments. It's one of my favorite subjects, and I hope you'll have an appreciation for it. As you might expect, in that vein, I have traveled to many battlefields. I find those deeply fascinating and deeply moving at times. If you ever go to Antietam in Maryland, which is Sharpsburg, Maryland, basically, if you ever go to Gettysburg or Shiloh in Tennessee, Gettysburg's in Pennsylvania, you go out other places, Vicksburg in Mississippi, and smaller battlefields, all the more, Chickamauga in Georgia. They all have their part to play and their words to give to those who would hear it. So I have enjoyed traveling. As a historian, I guess that's what I would do, and my daughter will hopefully appreciate maybe later on in life the traveling that she'll end up doing with me and Miss Gloria because of our love of history and mine, particularly the Civil War. Been to many battlefields. Civil War itself is going to take the lives of about 660,000 individuals. It is a big affair. Obviously, 660 is the classic number. It's probably higher if you really wanted to push me on it. But if I was to give you a statistic, I'd say 660, meaning 660,000 dead in the war, and I'll call it at that. But at the same time, it's in some respects a modern conflict. You have logistics that are going to be modern. In fact, you're going to have the ability to raise and muster large and huge armies for American history. You have industrial revolution at work. Mass producing great amounts of weaponry and such. In addition to that, it's also very primitive because it's pre-modern medicine, and you won't see penicillin or any other antibiotics or even germ theory or understandings of why you need to practice good hygiene in the war. It's just there are things in there that we take for granted that they would know nothing about. So in that sense, you should be very glad that you live in the 21st century and not in their time period, because a lot has changed in the last 150 or so years. It's also fair to remember, too, because of our ignorance, and I say ignorance means like you haven't, you won't take the time to find it. I don't mean it that way, of course. I mean it is we just haven't discovered it. But when our ignorance of medicine and what is good hygiene and practices and so forth, let alone anything else, it's fair to remember that in this war, like every war prior to the World War II, and that's worth remembering, too, I guess, just as a general historical nugget that you can kind of lock your brain around and keep and impress your friends with from time to time, is that until World War II, every war in the history of man of any size, where men and occasionally women came together in army groups of some sort or another, of some size or another, always spread viruses and always spread illnesses and bacterium and such. And it's no different here. For every one person killed in combat in the Civil War, 2 people will be killed by disease of some sort or another. So that's not unusual. And so we talk about this, the effect of this war. Another effect of this war in a general macro sense, I talk a lot more about it in a 1302 class. Some of you who have had me before perhaps will remember this. But the Civil War will have an interesting impact, and not a good one, frankly, in my opinion, historically, upon religion, especially the Protestant denominations. I am not here to tell you that people fought in the Civil War and they all abandoned faith and became atheist or agnostic. I am here to say, though, is that I think you can make a fairly clear case, especially amongst the elites who fight in the armies, especially the Harvardians, Yaleys, Princetonians, and I guess it's Princetonians. But anyways, all those elites, Ivy Leaguers, perhaps it might be your future presidents and Supreme Court justices, important senators, and so on. People who come from the Beacon Hill in Boston and Baltimore, also Washington, New York City, and on I can go. Those important individuals who are small in number but large and important in class. A lot of them who may have had a tenuous faith going into the war were never the same again. They never really believed with any fervency, and many of them quit going altogether. Many men will suffer crises of doubt. Famously for me, I'm thinking of this, and I go into more detail in 1302, is James Garfield, just because of the randomness of the war. That was one thing, just the total carnage of the war, the violence, just everything that just assaulted all that was supposed to be good Christian and civilized and organized, seemingly was disorganized, unchristian, and just hell on earth. And random. Why did one man live and another die? Why did one man standing next to me or 3 men standing around to me catch bullets, so to speak, and I was the only one that survived? There's no rhyme or reason. There's nothing you can do. And so in that sense, it challenged people with a lot of faith issues. And conversely, too, to be clear, very clearly, is that many men, thousands of men, frankly, will become very fervent believers because brushing closely to death, like these men will do, whether it's because of the battlefield, which at times, especially through most of the war, was a distant thing. The battlefield, it was not constant warfare. It was occasional battle. And so boredom was an issue. But when the battle came close and the bullets whistled past your ear, or you were in the middle of a camp at Falmouth in Virginia, And so, and you have all these guys around you who are sick with some sort of fever like typhus or typhoid, cholera, scarlet fever, which is essentially severe throat infection, in fact, or which is, what is it? Let's see, I was going to say scarlet fever is, it's a throat infection. Some of you've had it before, actually. I'm drawing a blank on this one. I should have wrote all these things down and just read from a script. But anyways, basically it's like strep throat. It is strep throat, the form of it. All that to say, though, is that the death that's all around you, and so your mind is forced to deal with the issue of the afterlife. Is the afterlife real? Who makes the right claims? Most of these people would have been Christian to begin with, whether they were fervent believers or just curious onlookers, or they went because mom and dad pushed me to church. Depends on the individual. But for many men in coming through this conflict, they find themselves becoming very devout because of the war and because you got to get right with God. And so they do. So it's a rather interesting dichotomy. You go through the war, especially if you go through a long period. You didn't just enlist at the end and you just survived. But if you went through 2 or 3 years worth of survival of the war, and you saw people killed, you saw people suffer and die, you saw it all. You saw the show, as they might have said. You would have to sit there. A realistic person is going to have some moments where they wrestle with the issues of faith, the afterlife, and whatnot. Most would believe. Very few would be left behind. Some would lose their faith. So that was a facet of the war that is going to affect a great deal of individuals. So when we talk about the war itself, I guess let's just go ahead and get into the details of it. So the war begins in earnest in 1861. As I said at the end of the last lecture, not all southern states are going to leave the Union right away. In 1861, those first states that left, it's really secession out of the South is a two-step process. The first step are going to be those deep South states like a Texas, like a Mississippi. As I said, South Carolina was first. Excuse me. And other states like Tennessee and Virginia and Arkansas and some of the other states are going to hold out for a longer period of time. And so as the secession momentum gathers, the question is, what do you do? How do you go about establishing yourself as a new government? And better question is, what is the Lincoln administration going to do? Abraham Lincoln is determined not to be a ditherer like James Buchanan, but I think it's fairly clear that Abraham Lincoln is not trying to bring on a general war. However, also, Lincoln is not willing to roll over, and he was elected in many respects because he more or less promised not to roll over to the demands of the Southerners. The Southerners basically continued to say, even as they were starting to walk out and leave, is that if you want us to come back, you have to give us everything we want regarding slavery. You have to promise us that slavery can be whatever and wherever it wants to go. And for Lincoln, that was a non-starter. Lincoln's clear answer was, and it had been this way for some time for him, was that slavery was going to exist in Texas and Alabama where it was. It was just like you cocooned it where it existed. Or you walled it off, or you quarantined it, to borrow a phrase in 2020. But basically, you're going to wall it off, and there you sit. Now, where does it get beyond that? Does it go beyond that? And for Lincoln, the clear answer was no, slavery's not going to go to the territories. It's certainly not going to go to Massachusetts or New York where they don't want it. So all that to say is Lincoln was not going to roll over for the Southerners, and the Southerners continued their march out the door. But if you're Southern now, you got to elect a government, and they're going to nominate Jefferson Davis. You might as well write his name down. Jefferson Davis is the first and frankly only president of the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis had made a name for himself over his public career. Davis had made a name for himself in the war with Mexico. He was actually for a while the son-in-law of old Zach Taylor, the war hero out of that war. He's a Mississippian. Jefferson Davis is going to survive a yellow fever outbreak, killed his bride. She was a very young woman, killed his bride, and he survives, but he was he was blind in one eye because of it. But the war with Mexico, he was a hero in that thing. Then later in the 1850s under Franklin Pierce, he will serve as what was it, Secretary of War. And so if you've ever been out in West Texas, Fort Davis, Jeff Davis County, those are named for him in that part of the world. Fort Davis was created as kind of a stopover point for the Pony Express headed westward, and wagon trains and military operations headed westward in the 1850s, named for Secretary of War Davis. And then Jeff Davis County, without having me looked, it probably is more because of him being a Confederate president. All is to say is that they picked Davis as the president. And Davis has got a problem. Davis himself is a mixed character. Some people find him to be cold and uncongenial, aloof, a know-it-all, a braggart, just untrusting, unloving, all those sorts of things there. Sam Houston of Texas, and Texas fame, who himself had been a president of a republic trying to get off the ground, referred to Sam Houston, because they both had served in the U.S. Senate together. Davis, at the time of the Civil War, was a senator from Mississippi, and Senator Houston referred to Senator Davis as cold as a lizard and as ambitious as Lucifer. So all that to say is that you'll find others who swear by the man. But he's kind of an interesting character, but he's got a problem, and was true for President Houston in the Republic of Texas, is what do? You've got to establish a government, pick people, put them in your cabinet, call Congress into session. The Confederate state constitution, or Confederate national constitution, is not a whole lot different from the U.S. Constitution, but with several important differences. Explicitly, slavery is legal. It is not to be touched. There is no doubt about that. Next, it gives a much stronger hand to the states, and to the chagrin of Davis and the government, at least initially, that is going to be a problem. Davis will have to deal with the issue of states that were very independent-minded. Heck, there were times that even the state of Georgia in the 1860s, 63 or 4, I believe it was, had talked about trying to secede from the Confederate States of America. It was a very fractious thing. It wasn't as unworkable as the Articles of Confederation, but the Confederate Constitution was much weaker, at least initially, than was the federal Constitution. And by the way, the reason I say it was initially, the war itself and the circumstances of the war is going to force a whole lot of power and force a whole lot of decisions into the hands of Davis with regard to the organization of the South into a war economy that was never conceived of at the outset of the war. Because, by the way, this is also something remembering too. It's true for both North and South. Both sides in 1861 or 1860 thought that the war was going to be a short affair. Many Southerners came to the conclusion, and after watching the North over many years, is that the Northerners might not fight, or if they did fight, they would lose interest or they would lose heart after a few weeks, maybe a few months of combat. Nobody was going to get killed in any serious numbers, and the North would quit. And the Northerners thought much the same of the Southerners, that they were actually bluffers, they were braggarts, they were hotheads, but push come to shove, and bullies, to use an overworked phrase. But after time, and after the Northerners stood up and fought, as I used that phrase in the last class, or the last lecture, they stood up and fought for their rights. They organized an army. They marched on wherever they needed to march on. The Southerners would run for the hills, and they would be dispersed, and there wouldn't be much bloodshed. Obviously, both sides were just completely wrong about that. But back to Davis, he's got to organize a government. And one of the things a government, if it's going to be claiming to have any sort of authority and any sort of mandate, is that they've got to control their own territory. And that brings us to South Carolina, and more particularly Charleston, South Carolina. As you may know, the federal government, as you may know, and I have alluded to, the federal government had forts and bastions and citadels in various parts of the South. And it was true in the North, and it was true in the West. It wasn't like it was the South that only had it. But you had fortresses at the mouth of Mobile Bay, at the mouth of Pensacola Bay, to come to mind. In addition to that, you'll have fortresses in around Galveston, also down around New Orleans. It makes sense that your major ports are going to need to be defended. So prior to the Civil War, in the years and the decades prior to the Civil War, the U.S. government had spent money and time and some blood, I guess you could say, too, building fortifications along the major ports of the United States. So when we talk about the fortifications, you also had a big fort at Charleston. It's called Fort Sumter. There were some smaller ones, but Fort Sumter in 1861 was a completed and garrisoned fortification essentially at the opening of the Charleston harbor. So what do you do with it? It's kind of like a thorn in the side. In other fortifications, like down in San Antonio, you had some forts in and around San Antonio. One that was even using the old Alamo as an outpost. The fortifications in San Antonio were turned over and surrendered to the Confederates. The Confederate government of Texas, which had deposed Sam Houston by this point in time, who had been a governor of Texas, the only man ever to do that. But the Confederate government of Texas in 1861 went to the the federal commander, the Union commander in San Antonio, and said, surrender the armaments, surrender the fort, and evacuate Texas immediately. And the Union commander, the federal commander, said, fine, I'm out. And in fact, actually, the Southerners would say time and time again, if you will just let us leave, there doesn't have to be a war. And so you may argue about that. Did there have to be a war? I guess it depends on your idea of can the Union be dissolved? And so Lincoln's answer was no, the Union cannot be dissolved. It is illegal. It is a fact that the Union is perpetual forever, in perpetuity, to use a phrase. But Southerners would argue very differently and say the Union is not perpetual. It is made up of the states that formed it. And so if a state that forms it wants to get out, it can leave. So a very fundamental difference right there you probably ought to make note of. But anyways, but Southerners said if you just let us leave, we'll leave in peace. There has to be no bloodshed. Lincoln was not prepared to allow that. He was not prepared to allow that sort of thinking. The line of thinking that the Union is perpetual goes all the way back to at least the arguments that are going to be used, many of which will go back to Daniel Webster in this nullification crisis of the 1830s. Webster just absolutely thrashes Robert Hayne verbally, rhetorically on the floor of the Senate. James Buchanan, even as worthless as he was, the worst president, as I think, in the history of the Republic, if not him, Andrew Johnson right after Lincoln. James Buchanan himself trotted out the argument that the more perfect Union. If it's already more perfect and it's more perfect, then you cannot dissolve it. It can't be torn down. You cannot leave. And Lincoln will essentially adopt those lines of legal reasoning. Lincoln was very well versed in what Lincoln's a lawyer, remember, in what it meant for the Union to stick together, and could the South leave and could it not leave. Anyways, Lincoln was determined to save the Union in 1861, and he is determined to reinforce that garrison run by Robert Anderson at Fort Sumter. Lincoln made it clear to the Southerners that the garrison, or rather the reinforcement of that garrison, was going to be done not with military supplies so much, but with food and other general non-military supplies. The problem, though, is that if you're Davis and the Confederates, that is a thorn in your side and a big old symbol sitting out there in one of your principal harbors, that if you cannot eradicate them, and if you cannot drive them out of your territory, then you don't have much of a claim on being much of a government. In essence, it would be somewhat analogous to having a British Army parade past Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1776 while the Continental Congress was passing the Declaration of Independence. They don't work together very well. You can't have one and the other. You can't claim independence and lose, especially early on, cede control of some of your territory that you claim. And so the Confederates felt backed into a corner. And so I say backed into a corner, and Lincoln did it. I don't blame him for doing it. I mean, you're trying to hold the Union together, and you don't want to give them the point, and you don't want to give them the legal point of letting the South claim that territory. Because, by the way, so to put this in notes too, Lincoln is going to simply say, and others will go along with it to some degree or another, that the Southern states never seceded. It was illegal to secede, and so those Southern states acting as the Confederate state of South Carolina, they had no legal basis. So Lincoln's going to try to reinforce it. Well, Davis is backed into a corner, and he probably made a mistake by firing on that fortification when he did, but he felt like he had to. He felt like it was necessary for the sovereignty or the demonstration of the control of territory as a government has to control. And so the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter. The first real shots of the Civil War are fired. It was a loud affair, but no one really got hurt. You had injuries, but no one got killed. Fort Sumter will run up the white flag and surrender, but when it's all said and done, it is a dramatic opening, a dramatic rise of the curtain on the war. But as we go into the summer months of 1861, the first real battle of the Civil War that catches our attention, it's the first battle. The firing on Fort Sumter is just the opening of the war. But the first battle of the Civil War is, in Union terminology, it's called the Battle of Bull Run. And the Battle of Bull Run, in Union terminology, in Southern namings, they called the Battle of Manassas Junction. Well, anyways, the reason it's called Manassas Junction, and you probably ought to write this down, is that you will see through the Civil War many battles, small and large, fought in and around railroad junctions. One of the things that both sides hoped to use to maximum advantage was the railroads. The railroads allow you to move men around quickly, move supplies around quickly. You can get an army from one state to the next in a timely fashion. You can rush reinforcements to a threatened area quickly. And one of the thinkings is that the Confederates are going to have at first, a little bit of an advantage with regard to railroads. It is true that the Confederates had less trackage than the Union, and that is certainly true throughout the war. It gets worse actually as the war goes on. But the Confederates did have what you can call interior lines, so they can work behind their armies can be out front, and the armies can be resupplied from the rear. That's the idea of the interior line. So you'll see battles fought. Manassas Junction is a junction of about 3 or 4 railroads in the northern neck of Virginia, or the northern part of Virginia. So this idea of the Battle of Manassas is partially playing on the issue of the railroads. Well, the battle takes place. It is a confused affair. It is not organized. It is a mess, a bloody mess. One might call it even a bloody fist fight, because these men were just essentially unorganized. They were mobs, armed mobs. The Confederates were green as grass, and the Federals, the Union Army, was as green as grass. They were all green. They all didn't know what they were doing. And a lot of people get killed. Several factors of hundreds, thousands, several thousand are wounded. It is a big and bloody affair. And it's sobered the nation up. For everybody who talked about this will be a quick affair, it won't be hard, it won't be too long, all of a sudden you have a bloodletting on your hands like the Battle of Bull Run that at first looked like it was going to be a Confederate rout. President Davis had come into the war, had come up to the battlefield, and it looked like the Confederates had lost. But the actions of several determined and dogged officers, including a fellow named Thomas J. Jackson, also known as Stonewall Jackson, turned the tide of the battle and turned what looked like a Union victory into a Federal defeat, one of many. And so all this to say is that it was a confused affair. People have speculated and said that if the Confederates were actually better organized, they could have marched into Washington, D.C. and taken the president and they sued for peace that night. It wasn't going to happen because they weren't that organized. None of them were. But you may have noted that I just said Virginia. Why on earth is Virginia in the war? So how did Virginia get in? How did Tennessee get in? How did these other upper states? Because Virginia, put this in your notes, is going to receive a great deal of lashes for fighting the war, meaning there's going to be a lot of fighting in Virginia. Virginia will have her breast, as it were, her chest opened up and raked and bloodied because of the battles that were fought there. Fredericksburg, the 7 days, in addition to that, Spotsylvania, Wilderness, Chancellorsville, and on we can go. It's all over the place. But the fact of the matter is Virginia is going to have a lot of battles. Also put this in your notes too. Tennessee is also a hotbed of fighting. And those states didn't go for the Confederacy right away. one of Lincoln's great dilemmas was, how do I keep as many states true to the Union as possible? How do I keep the southern states true to the Union? And the answer was, sometimes you couldn't. See, after the firing on Fort Sumter in the early months of 1861, Lincoln is going to call for militia. He's going to call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion. And so when Lincoln calls for volunteers in the opening months of 1861 after the firing on Fort Sumter by the Confederates, that was a straw that broke the camel's back, and many southern states, the Virginias, the Tennessees, and Arkansas, they bolt the Union and they leave for the South. They throw in. Their basic premise was, and I think I've always thought it was faulty, but their basic premise was, no, we're not interested in secession. Yes, we're Southerners. However, if you try to force those other Southerners to stay, then we're going to leave too. So it was a kind of confused setting. Question is, will Kentucky leave? Remember, Kentucky, as I've mentioned earlier in the semester, Kentucky is settled by Virginians. And Kentucky has slavery. It's a different form of slavery in the sense that it's not cotton-based as compared to the Deep South, but slavery is quite common in Kentucky, as is Missouri. In fact, actually, Lincoln was doing his level best to keep Missouri and Kentucky in, and Kentucky announced that they were nonpartisan. They were supporting neither side. And Lincoln thought it was ridiculous and scoffed at it, but at the same time, Lincoln was enough of a politician to know you can't force Kentucky to fight. Better to have them sitting on the sideline than conspiring against you. What about Maryland? Will Maryland fight? And there was some question about that. And of all the states that were on the border that Lincoln desperately had to have and keep them in the Union, Maryland is the one. Because if you think of your geography, remember, D.C. or Washington, D.C., the federal or the Union capital, the American capital, sits on the Potomac River. Virginia obviously leaves out, and then Maryland is that square for the district is carved out of Maryland. Well, anyways, all that to say is that Maryland had to be held. It will be held, and on from there. Though they have slaves as well, as does Delaware. So keep that in mind. Not every state that that is in the federal union has, or rather does not have slaves, or has slaves. Some do. So all that to say is that the slave issue is a little bit complex. But Lincoln, in a sense, by trying to force the South to stay and raising troops against them, causes other slave states to leave, and the fight is on. So the Confederate States of America will move their capital after Virginia enters the Confederacy. The Confederates will move their capital from a rustic Montgomery, Alabama, to a more genteel Richmond, Virginia. So the capitals of the Civil War are, of course, Washington, D.C. for Lincoln and the Federals, and Richmond, Virginia for the Confederates and Jefferson Davis. So we start this discussion. I'm already 33 minutes in. I want to talk a little bit about being in the armies. So what we've got to do here, so we've got the armies. We're drawing men in. So how do people, what type of men come to the armies? How do they get here? All those sorts of things there. So when we talk about the Union, let's start with some numbers. Number one, the Union has approximately 20 million individuals, most of whom are freemen, meaning non-slaves. There are obviously hundreds of thousands of slaves in the North, not nearly as much as in the South. But in the Union Army, or the Union soldier pool, you've got basically 50% of the pool get drafted or volunteer. So about 2.1 million men are going to fight in the Union Army in some form or fashion. Many are rear echelon, some are in the infantry, artillery, the fighting arms, others in the Navy and so forth. But all that to say is that about 2 million men fight in the Union Army. It's a big army. It's the biggest army in the history of the United States up to that point in time, and it'll be the biggest army we field until World War I, World War II. In addition to that, in the Confederate States, you're looking at about 750 to 850,000 men who are under arms, and that is about 80% of the pool of men. So the Confederate pool is a much smaller pool to draw from. Remember this, is that the Confederacy has roughly 9.5 million individuals. About 5.5 million are freemen. Of course, half of that is men. Remember, women don't play a role in infantry combat, with the notable exceptions, but the exception in this case proves the rule. But at the same time, for you talking about fighting and marching and soldiering, the vast majority of your soldiers are going to be men. There are some camp followers in both armies, but that's a little bit more unusual in this war than some. However, the South had a built-in advantage in some respects that the North did not have. Though the South is going to have a smaller pool to draw from, and 800,000 roughly are going to answer the call one way or the other, the South is going to be able to draw from another pool of manpower to help fill the rear echelon, quartermaster, and cook ranks and such. Obviously, the South has a lot of slaves. Of the 10 million, 9.5 million Southerners, 5.5 million are freemen, and the other 4 million roughly are going to be your slaves. Those slaves are going to be, not all slaves, but there will be many slaves who will serve in the Confederate Army, not in uniform per se. Very few actually do that. But they will serve in the Confederate Army. They will accompany their masters. Some will be dragooned by the government, but basically they will be cooks. They will be servants. They will be cleaners. Sometimes they're wagoneers and such. But it allows the Confederates to take men who might have otherwise been cooks or been in the rear echelon and move them up to the infantry ranks. And so that kind of helps the Confederates out in their manpower predicament. It's also worth remembering, too, what does what does an average soldier look like? Well, the average age, by the way, of a soldier in the Civil War, combining both North and South, is 25 years old. Most of your soldiers come between the years of 18 and 29, though you'll find some kids who are 14 years old, even a couple of 12-year-olds here or there. I think the youngest kid ever to be wounded in the war was like 11. It's fair to remember this about recruiters is that sometimes, and maybe oftentimes in the Civil War, they were very unscrupulous. They might even make an alley cat look honest or something like that, or a used car salesman to be virtuous. They were never very particular in as long as they met their quota, they weren't particular. In addition to that, when we talk about these men, there were some men who would be 65 and they're 60 years old, but those were exceptions, just like the kids were. But most of them are going to be white. Most of them are going to be Protestant. And most of them will be farmers. In the Union Army, you will have about 100,000 men of color who are serving in the Army, very famously portrayed by the movie Glory in I believe it was the early 1990s, late 1980s that movie was put out. But basically, you will have men who are going to freedmen or runaway slaves who are going to join the Union Army and fight one way or the other. Sometimes in the Union Army you will actually have them playing a rear echelon role as well, but that's not as common. So in addition to that, so remember this, as I keep saying, though I talked about industrialization, you still have lots and lots of farmers up north, and certainly down south, they are farmers as well. But most of them are Protestant, most of them are white. In the Northern Army, put this next part in your notes, the Northern Army is going to be made up of about 25% of foreign-born individuals. Many Irish and German units are going to be in the Army, some of which very famously fight well, such as the Irish Brigade with their green. I would love to buy a Don Troiani print of the Irish Brigade assaulting Marie's Heights. But anyways, the Irish Brigade with the Harp of Ireland on it and that green field of their company flag. Their brigade. Yeah, the brigade flags. Very famous. But anyways, you also have some German brigades that fight, some of them not so well, but at the same time they were there too. The South, less so. There was immigration to the South, of course, 9 to 10%. And I mentioned in a previous lecture a man named Patrick Claiborne. He would be a famous or prominent example of an Irishman who is fighting in the Confederate Army. So all that to say is that you've got yourself a fairly diverse army, large armies and so forth and so on. It is the soldier's life. So when we talk about the motivations for these soldiers, why did they join the Army? It depends on the man. It really does. These men aren't a lot different from their peers from other wars and other places. Perhaps a little more idealistic. Some fight for the best of reasons, others for less altruistic reasons. You'll have a lot of Northerners who, in letters back home and in diaries, articulate some form of, we've got to save the Union. And that's fair to remember that when we talk about Lincoln's predicaments as a president, one of the things you need to remember is that when we talk about why did Lincoln fight the war, it was, number one, as from start to finish, the Union must be preserved, to borrow Jackson's phrase. The Union, Andrew Jackson that is, the Union must be preserved. And so many Northern soldiers in letters back home talking about why they fight, and, in the scheme of things, they don't get normally asked directly, like in an interview, would you please tell me why are you planning to fight? Well, but a lot of those men are fighting for Union, to save the Union, that they identified as Americans first and foremost, though they may be organized by state, but they believe the Union to be indissoluble. And so they can't be dissolved, and so there it must be perpetual. So they may not use high lawyerly language, but they say it in a way that you'd recognize they're fighting for the Union. There are some men who fight for the slavery issue, over the issue of slavery, and they want to crush slave owners. There's some, but it's not I would argue it's not a majority by any stretch of the imagination. There are more than a few federal soldiers who could care less about the plight of the slave. They were far more interested in the issue of the Union. They weren't interested in fighting for the free the slaves, especially in the early days of the war. But there are some who fight for that reason. Others fight because basically it's something they get to do. It gets them off the farm. It gets them out of town. Never underestimate the wandering feet of an 18 or a 20 or 22-year-old young man. The war is on. It has a romance about it, especially early on for the first couple of years. You might get to see and do things that you heard rumors about with George Washington, perhaps. I mean, you got to go see the show. You got to go see the event, the monkey show, the elephant, the circus. I've sometimes heard it called too. But the fact is that when you did that, heaven help you. You got to see a lot more than you expected. But the adventure, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. The adventure of getting off the farm. And some of those boys, if they make it through the war, they're never going to go back. They're never going to go back to the farm. They want to go do something else. For many of these men, by the way, I should hasten to add this, regardless of North and South, this is the event of their lives. This is the event of their lives, and they'll never forget it. It would be like a great-grandfather to most of you watching this, who fought in World War II, and it was the event of his life. He may have come back and got married, had a bunch of kids, had a happy life and so forth, but in his heart of hearts, he may have said it, he may not have said it, may not have talked this way, but it seems to me as a historian, I've seen enough, that for them going into the service, fighting in the service, and doing those sorts of things was the event that they never got over. I mean, I don't mean it like in a negative way, though there would be nightmares and that sort of stuff, sure. PTSD, as we'd call it. But it was the event of their life at age 22. And just think about it, for some of these men who survived the war, they'll go on and live to be 55, 60, 65 years old. A few older than that. They don't live as long as we do. But just think about it. You've got another 40 years of life, and what do you do next? I mean, for that's always been an interesting facet of the story. So anyways, that's big. Why else do they fight? Some people will fight for because of shame. There's nothing unusual about that. Fight for shame because you were shamed. You will find this in southern towns, and you'll find this in northern towns. In fact, I think this was in a northern town in Ohio. I'd have to go back and dig it up out of the book that I read it in. But anyways, this one woman goes up to this skulker, this basically a slacker in World War I terminology. This young man had refused to go. He was not going. He was not joining the army. And this woman walks up to him and hands him a dress and says, "Put this on. You're not a man. You're a woman." Women stand back and men fight. They defend their country. Who are you? You're nothing but a coward. And she did this in front of everybody to shame him into going, and he did go. You got to understand, very different time period as far as male and female relations and male and female interactions and male and female ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman. The idea of today, like of a woman serving in combat operations, would be an abomination to a woman and a man of the 19th century during the Civil War era. So anyways, very different nation in that sense. So some will go for shame. Others go because their friends are going. That's been a story for 1,000,000 years in military terms. So towns, they have a rally, and a bunch of young men in this age group basically say, we need to save the nation, we need to go together. They may say all the right words, but they go because they're all a bunch of buddies, and they want to go do the same thing. So you have that. Heck, folks, it's also worth noting, just like some of your friends who joined the Army or joined the Marine Corps after high school, they joined it maybe for the uniform, but I wouldn't be surprised more than a few of them joined because they were giving away money. And the U.S. government and governments and kings and princes and potentates in the history of man have given away tons and tons of money in the hope of inducement of getting people to join the Army. It's nothing unusual. So that's all there. And by the way, a few, more than a few, frankly, but several thousand men are going to fight because they were substitutes. They were replacements for wealthy men or men who had friends who could get out of the draft. So that's a nutshell. But by the way, I haven't said why did Southern men fight? Why? Not just for the general ones that applied both across the boards. Why did Southern men fight? Was there any specific reasons? Generally speaking, when you look at Southerners, very few are going to stand up and say, I'm fighting for slavery. It was kind of an assumed thing. You might find a few of them talk about that directly, but most of them are going to talk about defending their liberties. For a man who's never owned a slave, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's defending his liberty to own slaves. He may never own one. He may not be able to afford one or whatever, but talks about defending liberty in the sense of my land, my right to do whatever I want, my freedoms, as it were. You'll also see Southerners who will fight for defensive purposes. Basically, they would say it like this: my home, my state, is being invaded. I will fight to defend my people. And there will be many people to this day and beyond who will say something along those lines. I'm fighting to defend my hearth, home, religion, my people. And even if you disagree with why the war was fought, that is a powerful pull, and it will draw you in. I say he's a historian, he's actually a writer, but wrote probably the best general history on the Civil War in the last 100 years, I'd say. I think it's probably the best one, personally. But anyways, a great writer. His name is Shelby Foote. He's a Mississippian by birth. Foote's have been around Mississippi politics for years. Anyways, he moved to Memphis, was a great prominent writer in the 1950s and 60s. His book on the Civil War, just called The Civil War, 3 volumes that are this big, an enjoyable read. You may be thinking that's crazy, but trust me, it's very good. And he was asked years later in an interview, he said, what would you have done? And he said, no question in my mind, I'd have gone with my people. And his people were Mississippians. And he's not saying he was pro-slavery. He was just saying, I'm going with my people. And that's an acceptable reason. To me, it's like you go with your people. You fight with your people. The reasons are all over the place. And the thing is that these armies wrote a lot, lots and lots of letters. They may not have been spelled very well. They may not have had the most crisp and correct grammar in the history of the English-speaking peoples. But they wrote enough that you got a real good idea of what they were up to. Some men are motivated by even medals, the idea of getting all awarded a medal. But it just depends on what you look at. It depends on how they go. But each individual could be there. Last but not least, one group I do need to mention to you. I did say there was a lot of runaway slaves or freedmen or just free-born men who of color who do fight for the North. Just simple as that. But also, it's fair to say, too, is there's a lot of Native Americans who fight for the South, especially out in the Trans-Mississippi region in the Choctaw Territory. There was a bunch there. So, anyways, just go on down the list. If you were thinking about what was it like to be a soldier in the camps, first of all, it was unhealthy. It was unhealthy, especially for a lot of these men. They were not used to opening latrines. They would think it would be unreasonable to not just go have an evacuation. That's a more polite term, I guess you could say. Have an evacuation behind a tree. The reality is that these camps are full of flies. They're unpleasant places and just breeders of diseases and bacterium and viruses and so forth. So to be in these armies, quite frankly, the better part of valor would be that you should want to be, you probably would have wanted to have come from a city. The reason being is if you'd come from a city, whether it's New York or Chicago or some other major American city, more likely you would have been exposed to viruses and bacterium, and had you made it to the age of 25, you were very likely to have been exposed to most of those things in the camp, and you probably got over it. So does that mean you have blanket immunity, meaning lifetime immunity, you're just not going to get it again? No, it's not like smallpox. Those smallpox will erupt in these camps from time to time as well. But at the same time, you're more likely to live. In a sense, you're going to think about it. Remember, for some of you, you grew up going to daycare all your preschool years. The earliest memories you have is mom dropping you off at preschool, and mom having to take you to the doctor's office because you had an endless line of ear infections or this or that infections. And others of you watching this, you grew up at home. Mom was a homemaker. Mom may have semi-retired for 5 years or 8 years or 10 years while she raised the kids until they got to kindergarten. And when the last kid went to kindergarten, she went back to work again, whatever work was. But and you did not have an endless line of ear infections as a kid. It's because you were at home. And so the farm boy who notionally would be in better shape than the city boy, yet at the same time the city boy probably was immune-wise much more prepared for camp life. It was said by the Union, as it was true also the Confederates, that each morning when reveille was beat, or when rev was beat, basically that there was just a gigantic set of coughs that just seemed like one heaving in the morning as people got out of their beds, out of their bunks, out of their tents, and they're just coughing because they had an endless supply of even tuberculosis. That was very common. It was just a very much a disease-riddled place. These armies are also very good about religion. You will have revivals, as I kind of touched on at the outset of this lecture. You'll have revivals break out all over the place during the American Civil War in North and South. So that was there. So religion will play a role. You'll have preachers come through all the time. Also worth noting, too, is that they were all singers. These were singing armies. Today, you're singing and my singing is horrible. No one in my church ever asked me to sing. If they do, they don't know me, because I can't sing in a bucket. And that's not to say these men were just lead singers. They weren't. But many of these men could not play an instrument. Some could, more than a few could, frankly. But you don't have any mediums. You don't have an iPhone, or you don't have an iPod, or you don't have, that's obsolete, I know. But at the same time, you don't have radios. You don't have things to listen to other than the music you make on your own. So they were singers, all over the place, singers. And you will see them singing songs as they march. It passes the time as you march. Some of you who are watching this are Corps members, and you sing, or you have some of them filthy, some of them more pristine chants as you do a run or as you do a march or whatever. They did, same sort of thing. For an example, in the Northern Army, one of the songs that they marched to was called John Brown's Body. It was generally speaking an upbeat tune, and it has a kind of a overtone of crushing secessionists and freeing the slaves, but it's not explicitly over the top in that sense. But they did march to John Brown's Body. Another Northern tune that had a jaunty air to it, had a march beat put to it, was called the Battle Hymn of the Republic. You know it probably if I sing the first lines, and I apologize for the quality of my singing, but mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored, and on from there. So that would be another one, John Brown's Body. The Battle Hymn of the Republic. And there's a lot of now obscure and forgotten and frankly not very good marches and upbeat songs. And for those of you who know anything about music, music is written and has about 4 or 5 keys. I think it's 5 actually. Some of you was like, so I took musical theory. It's got minors and majors and this and that and the other. No. Okay. I just know of minors and majors. And for those of you who know music and you know the different keys and the different chords, like a C minor versus a C chord, on a piano, it just makes the difference in the world. You can hear the tone. A major keyed song with a few minor chords, or even just no minor chords, but just has 3 or 4 chords in it, it has a very bouncy way, and especially depends on how your beat pattern, your time signature is. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. You can almost march to it. But the armies were also content to sing more melancholy songs. The minor key is going to be a very common thing. Songs maybe in the major, but with a bunch of minor chords thrown in. Some of these songs to this day are still sung in the sense that they are very much associated with the Civil War. One was called The Empty Chair. Literally, the empty chair. Another one was referred to as, and this one was, by the way, banned by both armies, and they still sang it because it was so much of a favorite. It's called Weeping, Sad, and Lonely, or When This Cruel War Is Over. Weeping, Sad, and Lonely. The Empty Chair, Weeping, Sad, and Lonely. Let's see another one. Lorena. Lorena was very popular in both armies, and it's also a kind of a melancholy song about a lost love and so forth. I mean, think about it this way. If you were in an army where you saw men die in combat, you saw men carried out because of disease, and it seemed like death was always around you, you wouldn't always sing the happy songs like a Southern would sing Dixie or the Bonnie Blue Flag or something else. So at the same time, there's going to be a real range and variety in these armies. So they were inveterate singers. There was religious revivals on a regular basis, especially in the dark days of heavy combat. Throw into your notes also as well, they were inveterate, they loved to gamble. They gambled on everything they could. Famously, there was a guy who was, by the way, lice was common in these armies. And so they had lice, and they would race lice. And this one man won with seemingly the Usain Bolt of lice, or life, that's what you call it. And they found out later on that he'd heated his bottle cap, and the lice just raced across. So they will gamble on anything, seemingly. Horse races and fist fights and, on down the road. They joined everything. You had Masonic lodges. You had temperance societies, meaning anti-drinking societies in there. You had Catholic leagues, and I mean, on down the list, they had groups all over the place. They were joiners. It was an era of joining organizations. They wrote a lot of letters. They had company newspapers. I mean, they were, for a group that didn't always go to school, they were actually fairly literate. In addition to that, too, they had to learn how to cook. Sometimes they ate less, sometimes they ate better, but they always ate a lot of pork. Lots and lots of pork, lots of salt pork. And so you get tired of eating the same salt pork day after day, and so you try to figure out what you're going to do with it. And so if you're a Confederate, you got a hold of some bacon, and your bacon was always just think about the cheapest bacon you've ever bought at H-E-B or some other grocery store, and the bacon starts out like this in the pan, and before it's all said and done like that. Confederate bacon, more so than Northern bacon, because Northern bacon just was a little bit better quality. Confederate bacon was oftentimes that real fatty stuff that starts like this and becomes like that. So Confederates, who often used a lot of cornmeal with their cooking practices, also decided, and they'd come up with various kind of homespun practices. So they would take the cornmeal, take their ramrod, and mix it around in the pot, or the skittle, or the griddle, the frying pan, excuse me, and they would mix it around, and they would mix in the cornmeal and the bacon grease, and it would congeal, and they'd cook it. They'd wrap it around their ramrods, and they'd cook it over an open fire, and they'd call that sloosh, kind of a cornmeal-based thing. They made their own whiskey if they couldn't buy it, and they drank it a lot, and sometimes they drank too much. Sometimes they drank stuff that was so fermented that you'd think it'd kill you, but no, it just got you really knocked good. And, Obie Joyful is a favorite name, and so on. But they did it their way. And also in these armies, it's not always universal, but they didn't always say heavens to Betsy, and they were cussers. Famously, I remember quite vividly a story when I was at Gettysburg, and this guy talked about, it was a guy who was talking about this one man who was a devout Methodist, during peacetime and even during his camp life, he was a man who never swore. He didn't drink. He certainly didn't carouse. He was a devout man. He was a follower of the Lord Jesus. But when he got into combat, he cussed. And after battle one day, a few days later, this subordinate officer, this guy was a colonel. The guy who was a really devout and pious man was a colonel. Long and short of it is that he got out of combat, and one of his subordinates said, "Colonel, I know you're a devout man, but I have never heard a man cuss like you do." And this colonel laughed it off and said, "Oh, Captain, don't worry. What are you talking about? You know me, I don't cuss." Another officer who had seen him at work said, "Colonel, you do. I haven't heard anything like that come out of somebody's mouth before." Combat could be kind of a funny thing. and it do things to people. Many men will carouse with, even if they have revival, it's just part of life in an army, for bad, I'd say. But there was a lot of carousing. It's not unheard of to have camp followers, hookers, which supposedly is named after one of the generals in the Union Army, a hard-fighting, hard-drinking, hard-fornicating guy named Joseph Hooker. I don't know if I believe that story, but anyways, the idea of camp followers in the form of paid prostitutes, yeah, that was common. In fact, actually, I remember reading one time in the year 1864, about 20 to 25,000 Union soldiers were discharged because of venereal disease. And so it was there. If it wasn't venereal disease, sometimes you will see men throw out pornography on the road to the battlefield, because the last thing they wanted to have happen is that when they die, and their last effects are sent home to mom and dad or their wife, they get sent home a lock of the hair, maybe a medallion or a ring, and a girly magazine or some cards or something of a naked woman. That was there. But these men were very human. I guess that's what I want to impress upon you. They were very human, and they fought for different reasons. Death was a constant companion to them. They were made to toe the line. Some men fought for the duration. Others fought for a short period of time. It just depends on the contract you signed up with. But at the same time, it was a full-on mess. At the end of the day, it's fair to remember, when I said 660,000 got killed in the war, over 1 million people were killed, wounded, and missing. Far over 1 million were killed, wounded, and missing. It could be tough. And so, all that to say, there's one last thing I do want to add this, is it is sometimes said about the Civil War that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. I think that's not really all that true. There were a lot of wealthy men who put not just their money where their mouth was, but put their backside in the fire. They went to fight, because there were more than a few sons of planters who joined up to fight the Confederate Army, and there were more than a few sons of Boston lawyers like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. who went and fought for the Union. So is it somewhat true? Probably so, especially with the draft laws in the South, because there's going to be a draft in the South early. There's going to be a draft in the North later. There's draft riots in New York City in 1863 over it. But at the end of the day is that these men fought, and it was a fairly wide representation throughout society that went into these armies. And it's an awful mess. It's an awful thing. So we'll continue in the next lecture on the Civil War with some more battles, some more characters, probably a few things on Robert E. Lee and Abraham Lincoln and so on. Thank you.